Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I'd like to share with you today an episode that comes way back from the old archives. We're going back 6 years ago, and if you're watching this on the video, you'll see an old office. It's nice to see old nostalgic memories popping up in old video. I'm talking about something that is constantly coming up, especially here we are coming in for Thanksgiving, for the holidays, for family time, family get-togethers. And family can be really triggering and can be really tough, especially around the holiday time. And questions come up about how to handle challenging situations with family members. And of course, these are real issues all year long. A lot of people think that if there's any kind of challenge or difficulty in a relationship, we have to cut people out. And this idea of toxic relationships has gained a lot of traction. And of course, and I talk about this here even in the episode, there are situations for safety reasons, for mental health reasons, that people do need to have separation, that there needs to be a discontinuation of contact. And that's very much a real possibility, especially when it comes to abuse or trauma or safety issues, things like that. And of course, it's really helpful to have a professional who's seeing the situation to give some objective, outsider kind of perspective to where those thresholds might be. But are all relationships that have difficulties, bumps in the road, conflict, are they all toxic? Do they all need those kinds of really strict, stark boundaries set where there's no more communication, where people are cut out from relationships entirely? I don't think so. So how do we navigate this? This is the big question, is how do we know where along the spectrum you are? And that's kind of the first point here, is you have to know that there's a spectrum. It's not black and white. Even when it's black and white, there's all different kinds of context that change the parameters for the long-term situation. And so I get into the weeds here in this episode, really unpacking different principles, different ways of thinking about this issue, so that it gives you some anchor points, some compass points that you can hopefully use to navigate through these difficulties. Again, I really recommend, if you're in a situation where this is coming up, to reach out for help. And it could be with us, it could be with somebody else, but just get some help. We're not meant to go it alone. And these kinds of situations are the kind that really could use some extra outside help, some professional help. And if you do feel moved to reach out to us, we do have free consultations available, CatholicPsych.com/mentorship. I'll put that link in the show notes here. But my encouragement is to just look for help somewhere, some way, if possible, if that's what you feel like you might need. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy the show, receive some of these principles with love, and I pray for you to have the grace for them to take root and be watered by God's truth and wisdom. And otherwise, I hope it blesses you. I spent the last 10 years learning how to help people using the best techniques available in psychology integrated with the Catholic faith. Now we've figured out that there's a better way to help people than just slapping a Catholic label on the same secular model of therapy you find anywhere else. The real question is, how will we make this shift to a new model of truly Catholic accompaniment, keeping the psychological sciences in mind while opening up to a more human and more effective approach? This podcast is here to give you the answer. Join me and follow along as I take you behind the scenes of what this new model looks like, using recorded audio from sessions working with my team, with colleagues, and even directly with clients. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast.
Today, I'm going to be answering a question from Brianna. And Brianna, if I could pull up your question right here. Brianna says, I just listened and watched your marriage course and loved it, even outside the context of dating or marriage. I'm a young single person. This class deals a ton with relationship naturally. Could you please go deeper in discussing the impact of familial trauma and not being treated right as a kid and how that can impact people physically and how to navigate really difficult relationships that are toxic or when not to? Peaceful, better relationships are the ideal, but when your parent is a psychopath, for example, that might change the game. In my experience, my biggest barriers to discipline are relational problems, like actual physical reactions to this. Could you please talk more about that physical impact and navigating it? So, this is a great question, Brianna, and I'm happy to answer this for you because I get this from so many people. We love to talk about toxic relationships. And for some people, we need to know when to say no, when to leave a relationship. We could be talking about dating. We could talk about family relationships with siblings or parents or children. I've had plenty of situations where parents need to say no to toxic children in their relationships. Um, Children are never toxic, but the relationships can be really destructive. This is really hard to navigate. So on one hand, we need to go into, boundaries and setting up self-care and making sure that we're not being pulled into other people's craziness. And I was just talking to somebody last week about this. They were like, how are you just ignoring what's going on in this situation? And I was like, there's a phrase I learned in graduate school: not my circus and not my monkeys. And that phrase goes in my mind a lot of times. How do we set those boundaries, stay out of other people's problems? And then at the same time, how do we stay Christian? How do we keep our faith, our charity? How do we navigate, like, what is the appropriate level of involvement if we really want to be charitable and suffer with people and suffer with them in their difficulties, even if it is difficult for us. So that's where I'm at right now, trying to help people navigate between those two extremes. On one hand, some people need to hear more about boundaries, and on the other hand, some people need to hear more about Christianity and being Christian to each other and not being so self-absorbed that you don't want to touch anybody's difficulties, right? So the image that I use to answer this question is the image of Simon of Cyrene. This is one image we use in our therapy as therapists with CatholicPsych Institute. I tell our therapists that we are fulfilling the vocation of being Simon of Cyrene. And what does that mean? It means that we see Christ suffering in our patients. And as Christ is suffering along the way of the cross, we join in his suffering by helping to carry a little bit of the weight, shoulder a little bit of the cross, and walk with Jesus for a while in the suffering of our patients. Now, there's a couple of important pieces there. We are not taking away the suffering of Jesus and carrying the cross like Simon did. Simon did not carry the whole cross. Jesus was still carrying the cross. But Simon was helping. Second, Simon stopped carrying the cross at some point and left Jesus to go all the way with what Jesus was responsible for in that moment of leading up to crucifixion. So Jesus had to climb his own cross. Jesus had to suffer on his own cross. Jesus had to die on his own cross so that Jesus could be resurrected and conquer his own cross. This is the model that we can use to understand the proper balance between helping people, being with people in their suffering, and letting people deal with their lives in their suffering. And we could be pulled in one direction or the other. Simon's initial response, he didn't want anything to do with it. And a lot of us can have that response sometimes. On the other hand, some of us might think that we're supposed to take the whole cross and we're supposed to shoulder it and we're supposed to push Jesus out of the way and climb up on his cross in his place. We do that with each other. We're not supposed to do that either. we each have our own crosses. If we followed the story and we went into the sequel, if we went into the backstory, the character story of Simon, like they do for like the X-Men, when they do all the individual spin-offs with all these different stories. If we did the story of Simon of Cyrene, we would probably find that Simon had his own cross to suffer. He had to climb his own cross. If Simon tried to push Jesus out of the way and climb up on Jesus's cross, Simon never would have climbed his own cross. And that's what we end up doing a lot of times. So we want to figure this out. How do we figure out if the relationship is pulling us in to try to take over somebody else's cross, or which that's a way of thinking about a toxic relationship, right? We have somebody else suffering for whatever reason. I mean, anybody creating a toxic relationship is probably suffering for some reason with some level of mental disorder. Not diagnosable all the time, but just not really getting it, how to have virtuous and healthy communication and relationships. And then when we keep embedding ourselves and engaging in those relationships, then we end up deciding to suffer because of the other person's suffering. So that's one way to look at like a quote unquote toxic relationship. So if we are not careful, we end up sort of trying to take the place of the other person on their own cross. Maybe that person should actually experience what it's like that people don't want to be around them if they continue to act a certain way. I mean, that kind of feedback is sometimes life-changing for somebody. So it's not just about self-care. That's one of the first principles I want to put out here. If we're actually being Christian and removing ourselves from a toxic relationship, then there's a way to look at that it's not just self-preservation, it's not just self-care. It's actually an act of charity and love for the good of the other person. So we can actually do more to help the other person by removing ourselves from those toxic relationships. On the other hand, by being a part of a person's life, sharing with charity and love, that also might be the right answer to help that person come around and really learn how to change their own behavior. They might need to receive love in a new way from you. Maybe you're the only person that's willing to actually give it. And so it's a tough call. How do you know? How do you figure this out? Now, no surprise here. I'm going to say that the first step is you really have to get a handle on discernment, because I'm not going to give you all the answers. I can't give you all the answers. And to say like, oh, when you have X, Y, and Z, then therefore, this is the right answer all the time, right? Anybody in this gig who's trying to say something like that, you got to realize it's probably not totally accurate. There's discernment that's required in every situation. You got to learn how to listen to the voice of God and find out exactly what God is calling you to. But I do want to give you some principles to think about. Number one, it's always the Christian answer, whether it means to help the person more or to let go of the cross and walk away. There's always going to be a Christian interpretation of why you're doing that. It's not selfishness. It's not all self-obsession. Even when we talk about self-care, we can still frame that in terms of living a Christian life following Jesus. Jesus says very clearly, follow me, pick up your cross and follow me. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's only by suffering that we're going to get to heaven. Let's put it out there. That's all there is to it. Self-care can't be about avoiding suffering. It's got to be about being the best version of yourself and following Jesus. And so the point is, whether it's self-care, taking care of ourselves to like take a rest, go on vacation, have a nice glass of wine at the end of the day, whatever it is, go for a massage, go for a run and exercise, all self-care stuff. Or if we're talking about protecting ourselves and removing ourselves from a toxic relationship, it can still be framed in a Christian way. So that's one thing that I wanted to make sure is grounded as a principle. The second principle then is, how can you be the best version of yourself? What you need to think about is your own self-control, okay? And this is where it gets a little messy, because we're very, very quick to say that a toxic relationship is due to a toxic person. And that's not the case. Anybody can develop the skills and the self-control. And I'm going to couch this. I'm not going to say 100% of the time, but I would say like 99% of quote unquote toxic relationships are not because of an absolute definitive need to move away from some person. However, maybe 50% of people who feel like they're in a toxic relationship actually should move away from the relationship. And that could be for a time. That could be just for, some amount of time. It doesn't mean definitively. And here's why. It's because we have to maintain self-control. And not everybody can handle every relationship. And it might be the case that somebody is really destructive in the way that they relate with others, and you get pulled into it. It makes you a terrible version of yourself, not the best version of yourself. And despite your best efforts, despite how many holy hours you pray, despite how many rosaries, despite how many times you go to confession, despite how many days you go to mass, despite employing the intercession of the entire communion of saints, you just can't control yourself. And you find yourself slipping into very destructive patterns of behavior. And, we could say the same thing for like dating, maybe, if you're falling into sin or, in all sorts of relationships, there might be ways that you need to pull yourself out. Here we're talking about toxic relationships. So the other person is creating these very destructive patterns of communication and behavior, and you are pulled into it. So the other person triggers something in you. I talked, I'll be a little vulnerable here. I talked a few months ago about a meeting that I had with a bishop, and I seriously disagreed with this bishop. And what I realized was it was bringing up the things he was talking about, the way he was talking, brought up some deeper stuff for me, going back to childhood. And I felt myself being triggered. It wasn't about the bishop. I mean, the stuff he was saying was just really unhealthy and really kind of destructive for the church. But besides that, I was not able to handle myself in a totally objective way. So I had to actually just stop and let the meeting go on and then walk away from it. Because I noticed in myself, something was getting triggered that was making me not the best version of myself in a relationship with this other person. And it was because of stuff from my past. Now, I should be working on that stuff. I do work on that stuff. And so, it's something that I could come back to maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years from now. I'll grow a little more. I'll become a little wiser, a little bit more integrated. I'll do all this stuff and work on myself. And I could get back into a situation with somebody where there's such an extreme power dynamic that even a bishop can't trigger those kinds of emotional reactions for me. And then I can revisit those kinds of things. Now, for you, you find ways that you might be triggered in relationships. Now, it could cause anger. It could cause dependency. So, somebody might play on your heartstrings. They say that, or, because they can just tap into something in you that you just can't say no. And you end up doing something that you really don't want to do, goes against your preset, boundaries or standards or whatever. And for whatever reason, maybe that's really unhealthy. And then you find yourself in this cycle where you come back and, you're resentful because it happened again. You did it again. They did it again. And okay, so this situation in this moment, you might describe as toxic. Again, it doesn't mean that the other person is toxic. It just means that there's something going on in the interaction, in the dynamic between you and the other person that is making you out of control, not being the best version of yourself. And at every level, at any level that's happening, you need to take a tiny step back or a major step back. The step back that you take has got to be equal to the level of disorientation and distress that the relationship is causing within you. Okay? So that's just a little bit of a paradigm to think about. If this person makes you a little upset, you need to take a little step back. If this person is making you like completely monstrous, where you're like a whole different person, that anybody else that sees you acting a certain way would be like, I can't believe that's you. Like, this is not you. What's going on? What's wrong? And, take a big step back. And again, you're not really looking at the other person. You're looking at you. Because at the end of the day, there's very few circumstances in which somebody is actually capable of overpowering your boundaries. Okay, let me say that again. There are very few circumstances in which the other person is actually capable of overpowering your boundaries. And just about in most of these circumstances, there's some element of us letting people overcome our boundaries. Okay. Now, again, I said before 99%, 98%. Are there completely abusive, traumatic experiences where, things happen that are totally outside of our control? Absolutely. Number one, I wouldn't call those relationships usually where that specific thing happens. Number two, if there was a relationship before something like that happens, then obviously you need to get out of it, and it like doesn't get a second chance. You don't give that a second chance. If you give that a second chance to be abused or traumatized, then we have to look at what other psychological elements are at play within you that we're going back into these situations. And again, that's not to victim blame or anything like that. We have very real psychological elements that might bring us into those situations. And that's what a lot of times I have to work with people on, because they find themselves, for instance, let's take off the table like that 1%, 2% of like that really severe trauma. But let's just say, dating a boyfriend or a girlfriend of a certain personality type that always acts a certain way. And then you break up with the person because of that. And then you end up dating somebody else because of the same profile, the same personality. And then you break up again because of the same situation. Then a third time, the new relationship. And you find these things are repeating. Now, is that your fault? Certainly not. That's not the cause blame, but it is to shine a light and say, there's probably something going on psychologically here that you can pay attention to a little bit more, to unpack a little bit more and find out what exactly is the wounds that you're trying to heal, what's missing that you're trying to fill, what's unresolved that you're trying to resolve, those kinds of things. And then you realize that these, toxic relationships are not necessarily because of toxic people. People are very rarely actually toxic. It's almost always the dynamic of the relationship. So should we leave those for a time? Yes. If it's a boyfriend or girlfriend you're dating, then you probably just break up and there's no reason to go back to it. If it's a spouse, well, then you need to take appropriate steps that are in line with the vows that have been made. And it all has to be measured and reasonable according to the parameters of the relationship. If it's a boss, you try to set your boundaries, and if they walk all over those boundaries, you walk out. If and you walk out day after day if you need to. If they fire you, they fire you. If you feel like you can't walk out of the meeting, then maybe you do need to quit. But instead of saying you need to quit, you maybe first look at, do I just walk out of the meeting? Do I set my boundary again? Do I repeat this again? The more inner strength and detachment that you build up over this time, you might have a different answer for how to handle this kind of situation. So let's go back to, when we go to parents, the question was about parents. If we look at that question about, Brianna was saying a psychopathic parent, and I'm not sure if she's using that term colloquially or if there's actually a diagnosis, typically involving a personality disorder. Then what we're looking at is how hard, how difficult that is to regain or maintain or maybe find in the first place a sense of self-control in the face of a parent. And why is that? Because parents have a unique position of educating a person and their very identity from the beginning. So this is totally different from every other kind of relationship. We're not talking about romantic relationships. We're not talking about sibling relationships. We're not talking about work relationships or any other. A parent is in the position of educating a child on who that child is. It's the parent's job to be a caregiver, not a caretaker. There's no taking, there's only giving. That's the relational disposition that's appropriate for a parent. And to some extent, that's always going to be the case for all of life. Certainly that changes over time. Its form and its modality, how that actually happens. But on some level, that's always going to be true. That's what a parent owes to a child. And when this kind of, self-obsessed, quote unquote, psychopathic behavior is creating the quote unquote toxicity in the relationship, it may be incredibly difficult to actually stay in that disposition. You're not talking about any other peer relationship. There's much more responsibility for the individual in a peer relationship than there is in a parent-child relationship. So, when you come into that parent-child relationship, if you're the child, then, because of what's owed based on your anthropology, who you're created to be by God, which is one who is taken care of by a creator, and that is mirrored through the relationship with parent, there's going to be a much, much more difficult time to create that separation and be able to fortify oneself against the inversion of parenting from a parent. Because a psychopathic parent, or even just a slightly self-obsessed or selfish or self-serving parent, is actually doing the opposite. It's an inversion of what they're created to do as a parent. And so you end up, as the child, needing to think about how to take care of the emotions of the parent. Again, this is the inversion of what's supposed to be. In order to get to the place where that's actually even possible to even think in those terms, you have to do an incredible amount of growth and self-work in terms of moving past childhood, adolescence, young adulthood into the reality of yourself as a young man or woman in relationship with God. This is part of spiritual development. And what I find is that there was a lot of people suffering from a lack of real human psycho-spiritual development. The best image I have for this is St. Francis. I love St. Francis. I was a Franciscan for 4 years. I always can find a way to relate everything back to St. Francis. Francis, his father was only concerned about wealth and, making sure he wanted his son to be, really famous and sort of, well taken care of. He wanted to be a knight. Francis wanted to be a knight, and, he wanted to have like reputation. And his father was this really wealthy merchant. And Francis grew up in that environment. It's a lot of wealth and opulence and good food and all this stuff. And then Francis had this radical conversion, and he wanted to give away to the poor. He saw that to follow Christ, he wanted to be poor and be less than those who are around him, just like God made himself less so that he could help us become more. And this was the paradigm for Francis. So he started giving away all the stuff from his dad's house. And he even gave away, the expensive cloth and all the clothing and all this stuff. And the father was so upset with Francis that he took him to the bishop. Probably know this story. And he said, because the bishop was sort of the arbiter of civil issues. And he said, what are you going to do? You have to judge this situation. And the bishop looked at Francis and he's like, That's supposed to take, you're stealing from your father, you're giving away stuff. I get it, but that's not really the right way to live. Francis goes, you know what? No longer do I call you father. He looked at his dad. He saw the values that his dad lived by. He didn't want to be fathered by those values. And he said, no longer do I call you father. God in heaven is my father. And you can have your clothes back. And he stripped himself naked and he gave all the clothes back to his father. So that's Francis sitting there stark naked. And the bishop had to clothe him with his own cape that he had. And, maybe that's symbolic. I don't know. But basically, Francis was leaving behind the wealth and the principles and the priorities that he grew up with in his father's house. And he was letting himself be wrapped under the mantle of Holy Mother Church and the fatherhood of God, who is perfect and built on the principles that get us to heaven and lead to a flourishing, happy human life. So that's actually what's necessary for every single one of us, to the extent that our parents' principles don't line up with God's. Okay? So that doesn't mean that we all have to have these radical, strip naked and renounce our parents' moments. That's certainly not the case. Hopefully, God willing, most of our parents are living according to the teachings of the church and actually do value the principles that we believe Jesus taught us to get to heaven. But to the extent that they don't, and that we've been raised in that environment, we need to be willing and able to put those old principles aside and trust God in his fatherhood and live for those new principles. This is incredibly important for psycho-spiritual development. And when we do that, we are reorienting ourselves to the objective truth, to the greatest truth of truth, goodness, and beauty, evidenced by Jesus Christ and his witness to us, that we can trust the Father, that we can live for something greater, and that we can be happy in this world and in the next world. So this is the paradigm that we need to have to make this shift. And if and when that can happen, when that happens, we can then return to a relationship with that parent, with the mother or the father that's creating those difficulties, and we see them in a new light. Okay, this is a major point, because a lot of times I give that first half of the story, and then we say, well, so what? What are we supposed to do? What about the fourth commandment? What about, how we're supposed to just reject our parents then? No. Remember what I said at the beginning. Toxic relationships are not because of toxic people. They're because of toxic dynamics. And the toxic relationship is because we needed to grow out of that childish child dynamic with parents, which is that they are the creator, that their principles dictate and govern our lives, and that we are subject to the principles that they are living by. And so we need them as parents, because we have nothing else, to developing out of that to the place where we realize that God the Father is our actual creator. He's our father. He's the parent. And if we realize we have a place as a child, as a son or daughter of the Father who's perfect, it relieves the pressure and lessens the damage done by the misaligned principles of parents who are not raising children in line with God's truth. And that, again, that could be, spiritual, psychological, emotional, whatever these difficulties are. It could be all ends of the spectrum. To the extent that parent has wounded a child, to that extent, the child needs to disown that aspect of their parent's parenthood. Okay? Now, again, I'm not saying even that they need to reject the person of the parent, but maybe you need a little break for some time. Maybe you need to put the relationship on hold for a time so that you can come away from it and actually reorient yourself to the Father in heaven. And like Francis, he reoriented himself to his Father in heaven and received everything he needed from the Father. And then, it's funny because I don't think there's actual evidence. From what I remember of Franciscan studies with the friars, I don't think there's actual evidence of whatever ended up happening with Francis and his dad at the end of his life. But I've seen like 3 or 4 biographies of Francis that sort of speculate. Francis must have reconciled with his dad. His dad must have come around. He must have realized the goodness and beauty of living a life for God, and that, he needed to sort of subject himself to Holy Mother Church the way Francis did. And yeah, we want to speculate. We want to hope that that's what happened. And some of those movies and biographies have really, really beautiful portrayals of that. From what I remember, I don't remember if there's actual evidence of that happening. But we'd like to think so. What we can assume probably pretty safely is that Francis would have been free to do so, because Francis didn't need anything from his dad. He didn't need his dad's priorities and principles, because he found the principles of everlasting life. And he knew that if he submitted himself to the truth, then that was a glorious life. So he could then go back and see the man of his dad. And we can see the woman of our moms. And we can see their humanity and realize this. This is where I want to bring this all together. This is the eternal truth. The eternal truth is that the biological parent-child relationship is temporary. We are called to the communion of saints. And in the communion of saints, we are all brothers and sisters. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ. We are united to Christ through our baptism into his humanity, and he brings us as son in that position of sonship to be a child of the Father, as a son or daughter. And we are united to the Father into that eternal divine union, and he divinizes us in that act so that we become one with God through our union in Christ. And at the same time, all of us here on this earthly plane and in our humanity are united to each other. We're united to each other as brothers and sisters. So the ultimate eternal reality is that all our parents are ultimately our brothers and sisters. Our grandparents are brothers and sisters. Our great-great-great-grandparents are actually brothers and sisters. I had a beautiful experience. I was in Sicily where my great-grandfather and we saw the apartment where he grew up, and like we got to spend some time with my family out there. And I was walking across this bridge and with my son, and my wife was saying, like, think about this for a moment. Like, this footbridge that connects this tiny little island to the mainland of Sicily in this place of Siracusa it's like a few hundred years old, I'm sure, if not more. It's where my great-grandfather would have walked. My great-great-grandfather would have walked. And it's like the same footbridge to the fishing, to the bank where the boats go off to catch anchovies and all this stuff. And it was like, I felt such a connection to him, but not as an old ancestor. I felt such a connection to him as a brother. And I was like, man, this life is so beautiful. And we're all carrying on this story of trying to get each other to heaven. And that's all that matters. And really, like, even the family structure is a means to heaven. That's the point. It's all about reminding us of and getting us to heaven. So the difficulties of our parents can be seen as we first need to move ourselves away from them. We need to heal ourselves with God's grace by discovering our true identity as sons or daughters of the Father, who reorients and re-educates all of us in who we are. He gives us our new identities, that this is what it's like to be perfected in Christ. And Christ is the perfect Son of the perfect Father. So that perfect filial relationship restores us to our truest capacity and our humanity. That's what we're made for, even if it's been disoriented by parents. And then once we have that, we've got it. We've got everything we need. So then we can go back to siblings who may be parents, siblings in Christ, and we can say, we can intercede for them, we could be present to them, and then to the extent that you are psychologically and spiritually able, you can remain detached in that way and have self-control in the moments with parents who are acting the ways that they may be still in very disordered ways acting, then you can still engage in a relationship. It takes a long time to get there. And a lot of people might have to just keep some distance. And that's for our own good. And maybe it's for their good. But it's never the goal to sever relationships with quote unquote toxic people. I think that's a misformulation of what it is that we mean by that term. So that's what we want to be able to think about. And then the opposite I mentioned earlier is true too. Like, it's not always the parents that are toxic to the kids. Sometimes the kids are toxic to the parents. And this becomes a little bit more difficult to navigate because, like I said before, the parent is still there to be the primary caregiver. Like, that's the primary orientation of a parent to a child. And that's always going to be the case. Now, here's where it gets a little murky, let's say. Gets a little murky because the parent may have certain imperfections in the way that they are actually raising that child and giving in to the child. So in order to be a parent, we have to create the best opportunity for that child to grow into his or her own adulthood. And what I find to be the case is, either a parent disregards what they owe to their children and leaving them and rejecting them and abandoning them, or a parent disregards what they owe to their children by overindulging them. And that is also a disregard of what a parent owes to a child. A parent owes a child discipline. A parent owes a child structure and order, because that is what we're created for, and we need to grow in that environment of structure and order. And if we don't get that from our parents, then we're being neglected. So if that's the kind of scenario that we're creating for our kids, and then they end up being, well, let's use the word here, toxic, in the sense of selfish, self-absorbed. They don't think about anybody else. They take advantage of everything that you do for them. They're abusive in their language. They're abusive in their actions. They're, on and on and on. There certainly is a point where, out of love, again, for the other person, structure needs to be created for that person. And so this is where, we have to use this paradigm. And that's why the Christian, the Christian model for navigating relationships is so powerful across the board, which again means is living for the other, sacrificing and living for the other. But sometimes that means not engaging in the relationship, because that actually might be enabling their vice. It might be enabling their behavior that's actually keeping them from a close union with God. But that's the way we need to think about it. So it's not black and white. We have to always think about these things in the both and. That's Catholic. It's healthy. We talk about that, and psychologically, like being able to hold the complexity of contradicting thoughts is actually a very psychologically healthy characteristic. And we call it black and white thinking, or splitting. It's like it has got to be all one or all the other. That is a psychologically unhealthy characteristic. I'm thinking of like 5 other podcasts I got to do off of this one, but one is going to be on toxic kids, which obviously kids are not toxic, but you know what I mean? And the other one is the both and how that Catholic principle is actually psychologically healthy. In fact, the Protestant heresies of all the offshoots of Protestantism and different heresies in the last 2,000 years can all be characterized as theological splitting, where you can't hold the complexity and the mystery of two truths at the same time. And so we pick one and we neglect the other. I talk about that with Catholic mindfulness. That's what Buddhism does. It's all about the oneness of the world, and it just calls diversity an illusion, right? So we can hold both and say both are actually true. So we can say that we are serving the other person and loving them by creating boundaries, and we're also maintaining our own trajectory towards holiness, because we realize if I let myself be in a relationship with this person, I'm going to fall all over the place. I'm going to lose my temper. I'm going to be really uncharitable, or I'm going to lose my boundaries and I'm going to enable, and then I'm going to be resentful, and then I'm going to lose my temper later. And all these things that are making me a terrible version of myself. And if you're a child, then, you have every right in the world to realize that that's happening and pull yourself out of that relationship. There's an especially egregious injustice when the parent is creating that toxicity for a child in a relationship. But it's still a paradigm that we can look at across the board. And I would say in most cases, once we do the work on ourselves, it doesn't matter if you're in a parent-child relationship, a marriage, a friendship, a sibling relationship, our goal should be to get to the place where we have mastered self-control to the point that we can actually, get into these situations without losing it ourselves. So that's what I got for that right now. We're going on 45 minutes here and I'm losing my voice and I don't have a glass of water. So we're going to wrap it up for today. But thanks so much for joining in, and I'll talk to you next time. God bless you all.
Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to help us spread the word and hear more, please head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and subscribe, as it really helps us to get our content out to more people. Be sure to listen next time as I take you deeper into what it means to be human. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.